Hey, Katie.
Hi, Ben.
So, in my new job at Facebook, there are a number of amenities, and one of them is there's this gigantic chess set.
Is it staffed with real people and horses and things like that will come to life and kill each other when you?
Well, it's not exactly the Harry Potter version, but it's maybe like a quarter or a fifth size. But it got me thinking about chess and other board games like Go. And it seems like a good time to do an episode about this, given that there was recently some news, a little bit out of Facebook and also some out of Google, about artificial intelligence and how they're doing against us human counterparts.
Yeah, it's been a big week for Go, especially. Let's talk about it.
All right, let's go. Ha. Sorry. You're listening to Linear Digressions.
So big week this week for artificial intelligence. As you said in the intro, Google, or more specifically DeepMind, which is a sort of subsidiary within Google that works a lot on deep learning, reinforcement learning, these sorts of things. DeepMind has been working on an algorithm that can play the ancient game of Go, which is like complicated chess. I'll talk about the rules of Go in a few minutes, but you should think of it sort of like chess, but more difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting too because the rules are actually simpler.
Yeah, it is. So, it's pretty straightforward, actually.
Yeah, the game itself is very simple, but the possible permutations, the possible different states of the board, and the type, I guess, of processing and intuition and pattern recognition that you need to solve it are a little bit more difficult for AI than, say, chess.
Well, a bit more difficult for AI than chess. And in fact, as recently as a year or two ago, we were thinking that there are many regimes where artificial intelligence has been surpassing humans, especially in playing games. And Go was the one holdout, and the thinking was that it would be safe from the computers for at least another 10 years or so. But as we saw this week, it looks like that lead that the humans have is crumbling away very quickly.
Yeah, so maybe we should take a moment and just talk a little bit about the differences between chess and Go in terms of the way that the computers might think about it.
So we'll get all the way to Go in a second. Let me start with some simpler games, and you can see the patterns that start emerging as games get more complex. So very simple game is imagine tic-tac-toe. You remember when you were a kid and you played tic-tac-toe, and probably sometime in elementary school, you realized that every game you're playing turns into a stalemate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, if you're good. If you're playing against someone who's really bad at tic-tac-toe, you actually might be able to win. But if you're playing against an opponent who actually is doing enough thinking about it or has sufficient practice, you will never be able to win, and they will never be able to win against you because there's always a move that will eventually converge to a stalemate between the two players.
Yeah, and this is an example of what we might say is a broken game. So for any configuration of X's and O's on the tic-tac-toe board, also known as noughts and crosses for those of our listeners who are across the ocean. So for every different configuration of X's and O's, there's some optimal move that will be the next move, assuming that it's your turn. And then you make that move, and then there's an optimal next move for the other person. And since the board is pretty small and there's only a fairly limited number of things you can do, namely place an X or place an O, then you can basically solve for the entire game. And you could imagine writing a very simple little script that a computer could just be pre-programmed in with all of the different configurations that the board could have. And it's almost like a lookup table. If you see a board like this, make this move.
Right, yeah. If you look at the size of the tic-tac-toe board, it's 3 by 3, which means that there are a possible of 9 squares on that first move that say I could place an X. And then your next move, there are 8 different squares, 9 squares minus the one that I took up. And then if you go on 7, then 6, then 5, and if you multiply all those together, then you get all of the different permutations of the game. And it's kind of a big number for humans, but it's really not a very big number for computers. So computers could traverse every single possible game of tic-tac-toe in a very short amount of time and effectively, quote-unquote, solve the game.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then going up in complexity, we can think of something like checkers. So now we're at an 8 by 8 board, and all checkers are created equal, so you don't have the complexity of different types of moves that you could be making. But of course, there are many different configurations of board space that you can have. And checkers, in fact, is a broken game as well. For any configuration of checkers on a checkerboard, there's an optimal move. And I once heard this anecdote about hundreds of years ago. They didn't have the computing power to do the tree search all the way down the checkers game. And so they didn't realize, basically, that checkers was a broken game. And I heard this story of a checkers tournament that the humans had basically figured out that it was a broken game, that for any given move, there was a next best move that they could make. And this starts all the way at the first move. So there's an optimal first move, and then there's an optimal second move, and there's an optimal third move. And what ended up happening was in this checkers world championship, these people just ended up playing literally the same game against each other over and over and over again because it was the best game, and it sounds really boring.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a lot of fun to watch the first maybe 3 times until you realize that it's the same game.
And then adding even more in complexity, we have chess. So again, we have the 8x8 board, but now there's many more types of moves that I can be making. There's different types of pieces that I have and different rules that apply to those pieces. And you also start to think about it maybe a little bit more in terms of a game that has some grand strategy attached and some structure to the way that you might be playing as a person, that you're trying to set up strategic positions. I suppose this is true of checkers as well, but I think it's much more manifest in chess. So chess is a fairly complicated game, and it's much more difficult to solve than checkers is in terms of what's the optimal next best move, because there's lots of moves that are potentially on the table.
Right, so you can't just run through every single possibility. I mean, checkers actually does have a good number, a pretty large number. It has a search space of 5 times 10 to the 20, which is pretty high. But eventually, with enough computing power, you can get through it. Chess is a bit more daunting than that.
Yeah, and so for a long time, we thought that chess was one of these things that if a computer could ever beat a human in chess, that's a sign of artificial intelligence or something, because we think of it as something that is not computationally tractable, and therefore for a computer to be beating human signals some kind of intelligence beyond just a simple lookup table like you might have with tic-tac-toe.
Right.
Of course, in 1997, IBM built Deep Blue, which is a very specialized computer plus the algorithms that sit on top of the hardware that was just designed for beating Garry Kasparov in chess. And it succeeded in beating Garry Kasparov in chess. And right now, the best computers are better than the best humans in chess.
And so the thinking would go that Deep Blue, this computer that was able to win chess, would maybe be somewhat intelligent.
Well, in the 50s, maybe 60s, 70s, earlier in the 20th century,
right,
that was certainly one of the lines of thinking, was that chess was a good benchmark for artificial intelligence. Because again, we think of it as something that you need to have a human level of intuition and understanding for. Now, it turns out that what Deep Blue does is actually fairly interesting and complicated, but the gist of it is just a very fast searching algorithm.
Okay, so it's basically doing the same thing that tic-tac-toe would do, maybe not going to the very, very end of each possible game, but it is doing a brute forcing where it's looking forward however many possible moves and all the possible games and deciding what's the most optimal move given my computing constraints.
Yeah, that's a pretty decent description of what it's doing.
Right. So not really artificial intelligence as we might have thought in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I think the term that we would use today is maybe weak AI as opposed to strong AI.
Okay.
So now let's get to Go, finally. So Go is where chess was pretty darn complicated before. Go is explosively complicated. So Go is 19 by 19 in terms of the board size. So it's more than 4 times as big as, just in terms of numbers of places where you can put pieces, it's 4 times as big as a chessboard. And the rules, like you said, are very simple, but they can interact with themselves in very complicated ways. It's basically a game of territory acquisition. So you place your stones, there are black stones and white stones. Each player has a color. And you place your stones at the intersection points of this 19 by 19 grid. And when you put your stone down, you're sort of claiming a piece of territory, and the amount of territory that you have surrounded by your stones is sort of the measure of who's winning and who's not. However, if you start to surround the other person's stones, then you can remove their stones from the board. So there's also this aspect not just of taking your own territory, but potentially of encroaching into the other person's territory. And so, like you said, very simple rules, but it can have very complex dynamics.
Right, absolutely. And if you compare chess and Go, the average number of possible moves in chess for a particular board configuration is somewhere around 35 possible moves. But with Go, it's around 250. And so that seems like, okay, it's like 8 times as much, but that's 8 times as much per turn. And so if you go 2 turns, it's 8 times as much plus 8 times as much, which actually ends up being 64 times as much among those 2 turns. And you can go further and further, and it explodes exponentially, like you said earlier, because the number of possible moves compound and exponentiate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this combinatorially explosive thing that even though we're pretty good at some of these search trees for things like chess, yeah, the Go tree is just blowing up so fast that we can't keep up with it computationally. And so this was why the thinking was that Go was sort of the last bastion of human dominance. It's because there are some humans who are very, very good at Go, and it's not because they're necessarily doing all the mental calculations of how to go all the way down the tree, but in general, the strategies that humans are able to come up with because of the way that we think end up being superior to just the brute force search algorithms that the computers are able to execute because the computers aren't able to go very, very far down the tree. However, it seems like that idea of the relative dominance of humans versus computers in Go, that looks like it's under assault right now. Because what happened this week was there's this group in London. It's called DeepMind. It's owned by Google, and they've been working on an algorithm that is designed to play Go. And this week, it beat the top-ranked European player, who's not the best player in the world. This algorithm will be playing the best Go player in the world, I think, in a few months' time. But playing against the best European player, it won very handily, 5-0.
That's 5 games to 0 games, so it won 5 games in a row.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, this was the 633rd ranked Go player in the world. So not the world's expert by any means. And if you read a lot of articles, they talk about this Go expert as if it's one of the number 1 players in the world. Granted, 633 is pretty high up there given how many people are good at Go.
Yeah, it will be pretty interesting in a few months to see how this machine does against the guy who's number 1, because it'll be
Right.
playing him. And so we can talk a little bit actually about the algorithm that they used here, because it's kind of an interesting blend of several different algorithms. Because like we said, just a brute force search down the tree is not going to get you very far with Go. So they had to do several things sort of strung together in a way to make this a more tractable problem. So the first thing is you have a combination of deep learning, which is deep neural nets with many hidden layers, and also a very clever way of doing a Monte Carlo-based tree search. And that's the big sort of overarching structure to the algorithm. So specifically, the first step in this algorithm is there's a convolutional neural net. And convolutional neural nets are the kinds of neural nets that they used for image identification in particular. So think of something that's related to computer vision. And this neural net is just looking at the board. And that's how it actually recognizes the structure of what's going on in the board. The next thing that these guys did was they had a supervised learning aspect to the algorithm. So they actually fed in 30 million moves from Go games that had actually been played by people.
Oh, wow. So it learned by looking at a huge corpus of past games and moves that that expert humans have made.
Yeah, so in particular, it had to learn, for example, the rules of the game. And so the way that you do that is just by showing it lots of games. That also sort of jumpstarts the learning, that it starts to get an idea of what look like effective things to be doing in certain types of situations. So there's this supervised aspect to it, but that is only going to show you a very small sampling of all the possible games that could be played. So that's not going to be nearly comprehensive enough for you to solve Go. So the computer also has to have a way of figuring out when it's on the right track. and it has to do that in only what we would call maybe a semi-supervised way. And so what they have is a reinforcement learning algorithm that sets up, by the rules of reinforcement learning, it has a policy aspect to it. So what is the computer going to do in a given situation? That's sort of what the policy is. And the payoff part of the reinforcement learning algorithm, which is whether it thinks it's winning or not. And so what it's doing when it's trying to figure out what policy to be taking, what sort of moves to be making, there's going to be many different policies that are on the table. Each one of them has combinatorially explosive numbers of actions that it could take. Different policies might be something like, I'm going to work on the structure in the upper right-hand corner of the board. And that might mean many different things. So that's an example of a policy and the moves. And rather than looking through the entire tree of all the different moves that it could make about developing the structure in the upper right-hand corner of the board, what it does is it has a Monte Carlo-based tree search sampling aspect to it. So it takes the distribution of all the actions that it could make associated with the policy. It samples from that distribution via Monte Carlo, and it looks at the types of payoffs that it would get for those sample moves. And it starts to get an idea without looking at all of the options. Just by sampling from the distribution, it can get an idea of whether the moves that are associated with going with that policy are going to be giving it a better payoff than the moves that are associated with some other policy.
Oh, so basically it's looking at a particular policy, like I'm going to work on the upper right-hand corner structure of the board. It samples from all of the different possible combinations there. It takes a relatively small sample so it doesn't have to go way down the rabbit hole for every single game. And then it evaluates that random sample to decide whether that policy versus some other policy is going to be more viable for it.
Yeah, and so when it's sampling from the actions associated with a policy, the way to think about that is that it's keeping the breadth of options under control. It doesn't have to look at every single option that it has for its next move. It just has to sample from them in a reasonably representative way and maybe take 1% of them. And from that, it can figure out which of the policies seems to be doing the best in a given situation. So that's how they constrain the breadth, is by this sampling.
And then once it has a policy, it can decide to actually focus more energy on deciding what to do within that structure, for example.
So then once you've constrained the breadth of the search that you have to look through, you also have to constrain the depth, because you can't be going forward 10, 20, 30 moves in the future. That's going to blow up as well.
Yeah, definitely.
The way that they dealt with this was they had an algorithm that could look, I'm making up numbers here, but just for illustrative purposes.
Sure.
The algorithm can computationally handle looking ahead, let's say 10 moves.
Okay.
It can't computationally handle looking ahead 20. So if you can come up with a way of estimating what goes on between move 10 and move 20 and what the payoff for you is going to be, then rather than looking all the way down to 20, you can just look down to 10 and then substitute in sort of that expected value for the whole rest of the tree. So rather than having to build out the entire tree of all the moves you could make, you just estimate how well all of those moves put together will serve you, and then you substitute that in instead of the tree itself.
So it's a way of extrapolating your likely payoff as opposed to calculating your actual payoff.
Yeah. And so between the supervised learning and the reinforcement learning and the deep neural nets and the convolutional neural nets and the 30 million moves of Go that this thing has been able to watch. Also, they had an extensive training period where they had the algorithm actually play itself, and that helped it train a lot. There were a lot of pieces that came together to this very specific purpose, but it achieved what they were trying to achieve, which was they beat a very good human Go player, and that is AlphaGo.
Linear Digressions is a Creative Commons endeavor, which means you can share or use it any way you like. Just tell them we said hi. To find out more about this or any other episode of Linear Digressions, go to lineardigressions.com. And if you like this podcast, go ahead and leave us a review on iTunes so other people get to listen to this content too. You can always get in touch with either of us. Our emails are ben@lineardigressions.com and katie@lineardigressions.com in case you have comments or suggestions for future shows. You can tweet us at lindigressions. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.